James Thompson pulled his pickup truck over onto the gravel shoulder across from the abandoned Collins house. He killed the engine and stared out the passenger window at the dying elm tree where Geoffrey's old tire swing used to be. It had been over 3 decades since he last set foot on this property. 31 years, to be precise, the span of time he and his childhood best friend Geoffrey Collins had pinky promised each other as kids to wait before returning here if anything ever happened to one of them. Well, something had happened. Geoffrey was gone, taken by pneumonia mere months after that fateful vow. And now James was here to fulfill his end of the pact. He still remembered Geoffrey's favorite saying about pinky promises like it was yesterday. If you break a pinky promise, you'll die within a year. As a rational 43-year-old man, James knew it was just a silly superstition. But sitting here now, seeing that barren tree where they used to play, a small irrational part of him still feared tempting fate by failing to honor their solemn childhood oath. James reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the rusty shovel he had brought. Stepping out of the truck, he slammed the door and made his way toward the elm, dry leaves crunching under his work boots. The closer he got, the more unsettled he felt, old memories resurfacing with each step. He could almost hear Geoffrey's voice calling, "Cooey," to get his attention, just like when they were kids and Geoffrey wanted James to come out and join him on the swing or in some adventure. But the voice was only in his head. The Collins house stood silent and empty, condemned after Mr. Collins' suicide and the prohibitive cost of asbestos removal. No one had lived here since the remaining Collins family left town 15 years ago in the wake of the tragedy. James reached the base of the tree and stared up at the frayed remains of the swing's rope, still tied to a sturdy upper branch. For a moment, his mind flashed to the dark rumor that had circulated afterwards, that this was where Mr. Collins had hanged himself. But James knew it was just idle gossip from those who didn't know the real story. Mr. Collins had used a rafter in the shed, not Geoffrey's beloved tire swing. James stabbed the tip of the shovel into the hard earth, thinking back to when he and Geoffrey had buried the secret that brought him here today. They were 12 years old when they found it, on one of their frequent boyhood treks into the woods and along the winding creek. An adventure that quickly turned into a nightmare. They had been following the creek for over an hour, much farther from home than they usually ventured. The water curved and brushed against a towering rock wall, easily 100 feet high to James' young eyes. And there at the base of the escarpment was a shocking sight, a wrecked white car, nose crumpled against the stone, half submerged in the creek. Even at that age, James felt a sinking sense of dread, knowing they were too far out for this to be anything normal. But Geoffrey, ever the car fanatic, excitedly identified it on sight, a 1974 Ford Falcon. He speculated with ghoulish delight that the driver might still be inside, killed in a plunge off the cliff high above. When they waded out and discovered the car was empty, James was overwhelmed with relief, until he followed Geoffrey around the front of the wreck and stepped on what he thought was a branch, only to reach down and find his foot snagged in the flannel shirt of a dead body. Frantic, he pulled free and fell face first into the creek, colliding with a second corpse in the process. The ghastly sight of fish-eaten features leering up at him would haunt James for life. But it was what they found next that would truly shape the rest of his days. In the Falcon's half-open trunk was a sports bag stuffed with more cash than James had ever seen. He immediately wanted to leave it, get away from this place and never look back. But Geoffrey insisted on keeping it, seizing on finders keepers. Eventually, James relented on the condition they didn't spend a dime until they were sure no one was looking for it. Surely a crime or theft of this scale would make the news. They buried the bag under the tire swing and agreed to wait. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. James was eaten up with anxiety, convinced they had done something horribly wrong. But Geoffrey seemed untroubled, and no reports of missing money ever surfaced. Then came the day Geoffrey's father took his own life, buckling under crippling debt after years of drought destroyed his farm. At the funeral, Geoffrey confided in James that he felt no sorrow, only hatred for his father. He even implied the money would have saved everything. James was aghast at the thought, and they nearly came to blows. 2 weeks later, Geoffrey and his mother abruptly moved away. On the day they parted ways, Geoffrey made James swear that blood brothers pact, to reunite in 31 years and recover their buried treasure together if anything kept them apart in the meantime. James never imagined that anything would be Geoffrey's untimely death from pneumonia. He always assumed they'd dig up the cash together as adults, putting childish vows behind them. Now here James was alone, shovel in hand, steeling himself to retrieve a secret that had weighed on him for over half his life. Letting out a heavy sigh, he sank the blade into the dirt and began to dig. The work was short, the bag having been buried shallow to avoid detection. Within minutes, his shovel struck yielding cloth. James dropped to his knees and brushed the loose soil away, revealing a faded navy nylon zipper. His heart began to race as he seized the strap and pulled, the rotten bag tearing free of the earth with far less resistance than expected. James lost his balance and fell backwards, the sports bag flopping open in his lap. But instead of the anticipated flood of musty bills, there was only a single scrap of muddy paper. Hands trembling, James unfolded the filthy sheet to find 2 words scrawled in the smudged yet unmistakable chaotic script of his long-dead friend. Et-o-et-o-et-o-e. James stared at the note in mute incomprehension. Sorry for what? Keeping a staggering secret that ate at James' conscience for decades? Roping him into a childhood vow he felt bound to even as a grown man? Leaving him alone to deal with the emotional fallout of that traumatic day while Geoffrey escaped into death? The message explained nothing and did little to salve James' turbulent feelings. With an anguished cry, James crushed the paper in his fist and hurled it away, suddenly furious. All these years of repressed guilt and unresolved grief over that fateful, never-spoken-of discovery. And for what? An empty bag and an insultingly glib non-apology from beyond the grave? He slumped back against the elm tree, feeling hollow and spent. Overhead, a crow cawed and launched from a skeletal branch, the beating of its wings echoing James' own thudding heart. The anger slowly ebbed, giving way to a renewed sense of loss. Geoffrey had been dead longer than he'd been alive. It was long past time for James to make peace with that and release himself from a child's promise. But he still needed answers. Maybe they'd never been best friends after that day at the creek. Maybe that violation of innocence and resulting pact had poisoned any chance of that. James didn't know. He did know he couldn't end this 3-decade-long chapter on a torn, empty bag and 1 scrawled word. Not if he ever wanted to put the nightmares and survivor's guilt to rest. Taking a deep, shaky breath, James pulled himself to his feet, brushed off his jeans, and strode purposefully back to his truck. He had one more stop to make today, the Collins family plot in the town cemetery. He needed to have a man-to-man talk with Geoffrey, even if it was just James doing the talking part. Unload his heart, say his piece, and finally close the book on a childhood betrayal that changed the trajectory of 2 young lives. As he drove toward the cemetery, James felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in far too long, a lightening in his chest, a loosening of the ever-present band of anxiety around his heart. He didn't know quite what he'd say when he reached Geoffrey's headstone. There was so much ground to cover, but he knew he owed it to both of them to give voice to the aching, unspoken things that had festered for half a lifetime. Maybe in the speaking of them, in the voicing of his long-buried grief and rage, James might finally find the absolution and closure he so desperately craved. And if along the way, in the sacred space of eternal rest, he discovered the capacity to forgive his long-ago blood brother and release them both from a broken promise, well, that would be a start. For the first time since he was 12 years old, standing on the brink of a dark and twist-filled path, James felt a small spark of hope. He didn't know what the future held, only that after today, he would no longer be shackled to the past. He would lay that burden down with gentleness at the feet of the friend he once loved more than any other, speak his truth, open his heart, and then walk away into the light of a new beginning, finally free. James parked outside the rusted cemetery gates and cut the engine. He had no idea what he'd find at the end of this dusty, weed-choked path, peace, pain, or some strange alchemy of the two. But he knew with utter conviction it was a journey he needed to make, and make alone, to honor the boy he was and the man Geoffrey never got the chance to be. He picked his way through the overgrown graves, following the curve of the path between time-scoured monuments and crumbling headstones. The wind whispered through browning leaves overhead, the gentle sigh carrying with it the first crisp breath of autumn. Change was coming, in the world and in James' weary heart. He could feel it. As he rounded the path's final bend, he stopped short, unable to believe his eyes. There, standing motionless before a small, weathered headstone, was a stooped female figure in black. James blinked once, twice, wondering if his mind was playing tricks. But no, the woman remained, and as James drew closer, he realized with a start that he recognized her. Even with 30 years of age and grief lining her face, it was Geoffrey's mother. James took a few slow steps forward, dry leaves crackling under his shoes and shattering the hushed sanctity of the moment. The woman stiffened and turned. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, widened in recognition. "James?" She breathed in disbelief. "Is that you?" James nodded mutely, a lump forming in his throat. Mrs. Collins took a halting step towards him, one trembling, liver-spotted hand coming up to cover her mouth. I never thought I would see you again," she whispered. "What on earth are you doing here?" James swallowed hard and found his voice. "Keeping a promise," he replied hoarsely. "One I made to Geoffrey a long time ago." Mrs. Collins closed her eyes for a long moment, fresh tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. When she opened them again, they shone with a fierce, desperate light. "The money," she said urgently. "Did you find it?" James reeled back in shock, stunned by her words. You knew about the money?" he managed. The old woman nodded, a sob hitching in her throat. "I did. I've known since the day after you boys found it." She took a shaky breath. "Because I'm the one who put it there." James felt the world tilt under his feet, his mind reeling as he tried to process her staggering confession. "I don't understand," he said numbly. "What do you mean you put it there? Whose money was it? And what about the bodies? Did you dash?"
"No."
Mrs. Collins cut him off, her voice cracking on the denial.
"No, goodness no."
"I could never." She trailed off, visibly collecting herself. "No, I didn't kill anyone, but I knew who did. I've carried that truth for over 30 years. James stared at her in mute shock, 1,000 questions jockeying for position on his tongue. Mrs. Collins met his eyes, her own filled with a bone-deep sorrow and regret. "I think it's time," she said heavily, "that I finally told the truth about what happened all those years ago. The whole truth. I owe you that much." She glanced back at her son's headstone, fresh tears tracking through the fine lines around her eyes. "I owe Geoffrey that much." She turned and sank down onto a cracked stone bench near the grave, patting the empty space beside her. James moved forward as if in a dream and sat down, his heart pounding in his ears. Mrs. Collins folded her hands in her lap and took a deep, shuddering breath. "It all started," she began, "with a man named Victor Holbeck. Over the next hour, in fits and starts, Geoffrey's mother spun out a tale of love, blackmail, and murder that left James struggling to breathe. Victor Holbeck, Mrs. Collins revealed, had been her first love, her high school sweetheart, the man she'd planned on marrying, until he fell in with a bad crowd their senior year and ended up serving a 5-year sentence for armed robbery. By the time Victor got out, she was engaged to Byron Collins. "I tried to put Victor out of my mind to move on," Mrs. Collins said, her voice choked with ancient pain. "But he wouldn't let me. Kept showing up, begging for another chance, swearing he'd changed." She shook her head. "I should have been stronger, should have cut him loose for good. But I never stopped loving him. And he knew it." Her affair with Victor Holbeck rekindled in secret, an escape from her crumbling marriage to a man sinking further into depression and drink with each crushing year of debt and drought. The forbidden romance burned hot and bright, until Mrs. Collins discovered she was pregnant. "I didn't know if it was Byron's or Victor's," she said, shame and long-buried anguish etched into every line of her face. "But Victor became convinced the baby was his. He wanted us to run away together, start over somewhere new. But Mrs. Collins couldn't bring herself to abandon her husband, to tear apart their family and Geoffrey's life. Enraged by her refusal, Holbeck began blackmailing her, threatening to expose their affair and destroy her if she didn't leave Byron and take his child. A child he still believed to be his own unborn son. The things he said, the demands he made, Mrs. Collins swallowed hard. It was like I'd never known him at all. He just snapped, became a stranger wearing the face of the man I loved. She fell silent for a long moment, her eyes distant with unspeakable memory. James waited, hardly daring to breathe. I couldn't see a way out, she continued at last, her voice barely audible. Every path led to ruin my marriage, my family, my whole life blown apart by the truth. And then the news broke about the bank robbery in Harrison. James' heart stopped. Harrison, the next town over. He suddenly remembered that long ago summer in sharp, dreadful detail, the rash of daring heists that had the whole region on edge, the gossip that a notorious gang of outlaws was in the area. It wasn't a gang, Mrs. Collins said, reading the dawning realization in James' eyes. It was Victor, him and a friend, two men so desperate for a new life that they were willing to steal it at gunpoint. She described how Holbeck had shown up at the farm in a panic, a bag stuffed with stolen cash in his hands. He'd wanted to stash it on the property until the heat died down. When Mrs. Collins refused to help him, terrified of involving her family, Holbeck lost control. He was screaming, totally unhinged, she recounted, her hands twisting in her lap, raving about how it was his money, his ticket out, and no one was going to keep him from what was rightfully his ever again. Not me, not Byron, not anyone. In his rage, Holbeck struck her. Mrs. Collins fell, slamming her head on the corner of the porch railing. The last thing she saw before blacking out was Victor Holbeck's boots pounding across the yard toward the then Sound Collins family truck, bag of stolen cash in hand. She came to hours later in a spreading pool of blood, disoriented and frantic. She managed to staunch the bleeding and hide the evidence before Byron and Geoffrey got home, telling them she'd had a dizzy spell and taken a tumble off the porch. They couldn't afford a doctor, so she tended to her wounds in secret and prayed her family would be spared the horrible consequences of her mistakes. That desperate prayer went unanswered. The very next morning, word reached them of a gruesome discovery in the woods, an overturned truck with 2 dead bodies, rumored to be the Harrison bank robbers who had fled with the stolen money. Mrs. Collins knew with sick certainty it had to be Victor Holbeck and his accomplice. But when the truck was described as a white 1974 Ford Falcon, her blood ran cold. "It wasn't our truck," she said, her voice trembling with long-repressed horror. Victor and his partner must have switched vehicles at some point, tried to throw off any potential pursuit. I realized he'd hidden the bag of cash in our truck and then driven the thieves' car off that cliff to get rid of the evidence. To get rid of them. But Holbeck, in his haste to cover his tracks, had badly underestimated the Falcon's location. Instead of sinking into deep water as he'd intended, the car had crashed into the sheer rock wall of the creekside ravine, leaving his victims' bodies and his blood-stained bag of money exposed for her son to stumble across mere hours later. "I didn't know what to do," Mrs. Collins said brokenly. "I was paralyzed, sick with the knowledge of what Victor had done, and terrified of what would happen to me, to all of us, if the truth came out. I'd been unfaithful. I'd kept secrets. I'd allowed that monster into our lives, into my child's life. And Geoffrey," her voice cracked. "I couldn't bear the thought of my little boy living under the shadow of my shame. So she'd done the only thing she could think of. Snuck out of the house that night, driven their truck to the woods, and found the mangled Falcon. Working by moonlight, she'd emptied the bag, buried the blood-stained cash in a shallow grave, and tossed the empty sack back into the wreckage. Let the authorities find it and draw their own conclusions, that the robbers had hidden the money somewhere else before their fatal crash. I thought I was keeping us safe," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting my son. But when I got home, I knew. I knew from the way Geoffrey looked at me, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He'd already found Victor's bag, found the bodies." She broke down then, great racking sobs shaking her thin shoulders. James sat in stunned silence, reeling from the weight of her revelations. He thought of how haunted Geoffrey had looked that horrible day, how insistent he'd been about keeping the money. Had some part of him known, even then, the terrible secrets that bag contained? The unforgivable betrayals? "I didn't know what to say to him," Mrs. Collins wept. "How to explain or apologize. I could barely live with the guilt myself. So I just never said anything, acted like it never happened. And it poisoned everything: my marriage, my family, my relationship with my own child. I let the shame and lies rot us from the inside out." She turned to James with pleading, tearful eyes. "I failed him," she said raggedly. "Failed my own son when he needed me most. And when we lost him, when pneumonia took my boy, the last words we ever spoke to each other were in anger. I never got to tell him how sorry I was, how much I loved him." James felt his own eyes burn with unshed tears, his throat closing around a hard knot of grief. In that moment, he understood the distance that had crept into his friendship with Geoffrey, the walls that had gone up brick by brick until there was nothing left but brittle pretense. He'd spent 30 years believing the money had torn them apart, never realizing it was the silence that did the real damage. "I think," he began hoarsely, searching for the right words. "I think Geoffrey felt the same way. He was hurting and scared and didn't know how to reach out. But he loved you, Mrs. Collins, even if he couldn't say it at the end." The grieving mother closed her eyes, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. "I pray you're right," she breathed. "I've carried this for so long, James. This guilt, this grief. I'm an old woman now. I just want the chance to make it right, to honor my son's memory with the truth." James reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You are," he assured her. "You are making it right by telling me, by facing it. That's the most honorable thing you can do for Geoffrey now." Mrs. Collins squeezed back, offering a wan, grateful smile. "He was lucky to have you," she said softly. I'm glad he wasn't alone in this, that you could be there for him even when I couldn't." James nodded, too choked up to trust his voice. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped, listening to the wind whisper through the browning leaves. Finally, Mrs. Collins stirred. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her coat pocket with her free hand. "One more secret I've been keeping all these years." She pulled out a small, time-worn envelope and handed it to James with a trembling hand. He took it, frowning in confusion at the faded return address. It was postmarked December 15th, 1993, just days before Geoffrey succumbed to pneumonia. "I found it in his room," Mrs. Collins said quietly. "After. He must have written it. Must have known he was." She trailed off, fresh grief twisting her features. "It's addressed to you. I didn't open it, but I've been saving it all this time, waiting for the right moment to give it to you." James turned the envelope over in hands that shook, his heart clenching at the sight of Geoffrey's chaotic boyhood scrawl spelling out his name. He could almost feel the fever heat of his friend's skin on the paper, picture the effort it must have taken for a dying boy to put pen to page. He looked back up at Mrs. Collins, staggered by the trust in her eyes. "You kept this?" he asked hoarsely. "All these years?" She smiled sadly. "For the same reason you're here today," she replied. "To keep a promise to my son. He entrusted me to see that letter safely to your hands. Now it's your turn to decide what to do with the secrets it holds." Hands trembling, James slid his thumb under the envelope's seal and carefully extracted the single sheet of lined notepaper within. He unfolded it with a deep breath, steeling himself for the words he'd waited half a lifetime to read. "Dear James." The letter began in Geoffrey's uneven scrawl, made shaky by sickness. "If you're reading this, I guess the pneumonia got me after all. I'm sorry, man. Sorry for leaving you alone. Sorry for a lot of things. You're probably wondering about the money, why I kept it, why I made you swear not to dig it up without me. The truth is, I think my mom knows something about it. Something bad." James swallowed hard, his heart twisting in his chest as he remembered Mrs. Collins' anguished story. I don't have proof, Geoffrey's letter continued, but I've seen the way she looks at me when she thinks I'm not paying attention. Guilty, like she's got some big secret eating her up inside. And that day we found the cash, when I got home, I caught her burning something out back. It looked like bloody clothes. Mrs. Collins made a small, pained sound beside him but motioned for James to keep reading. I didn't confront her. Couldn't.
I'm a coward, I guess.
Or maybe I just didn't want to face what it could mean about my family, my own mother. So I kept my mouth shut and made you promise to hide the money. Figured it was better that way, for everyone. I'm telling you now because I don't want you to have to carry this alone. You're my best friend, James. More than that, you're my brother. And brothers look out for each other, even from beyond the grave. A wavery smiling face was sketched next to that line. A spot of morbid humor so perfectly in keeping with Geoffrey's character that it brought fresh tears to James' eyes. So here's the deal, the letter pressed on. The cash is yours now. I don't care what you do with it. Keep it, spend it, burn it for all I care. Just don't let it become an albatross around your neck like it was for me. You set it free and let it set you free. And maybe poke around a bit. See if you can't get the full story out of my mom. Give her a chance to come clean. I think she needs that. Needs to know this secret won't die with me. Beyond that, just live, man. Live for both of us. Remember that time we raced to the top of Benson's Hill? I never told you, but that's the happiest I ever was. Just you and me, a couple of kids on an adventure, not a care in the world. So every once in a while, do me a favor, think of that day and smile. Smile so big your cheeks hurt. And know that wherever I am, I'm smiling right along with you. Okay, this is getting way too sappy, so I'll wrap it up. Just thanks, James, for being there, for keeping your word, for everything. You were the best friend a guy could ask for, the best brother. Don't ever forget that. Yours always, Geoffrey. James realized he was crying, big silent tears rolling down his cheeks and splashing onto the faded paper. He felt a gentle hand on his arm and looked over to see Mrs. Collins watching him with a sad, knowing smile. Without a word, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old Polaroid photograph, its edges soft and white with age. She pressed it into his hand. It was a picture of him and Geoffrey, no more than 7 or 8 years old, gap-toothed grins stretching ear to ear as they perched side by side on the frayed tire swing. They had their arms slung around each other's shoulders, conspirators against the world, young and innocent and utterly unaware of the dark turns that lay ahead. The sight of it, the sheer joy and trust shining out of their faces, undid the last of James' composure. He curled forward, clutching the photo and letter to his chest as great, shuddering sobs racked his frame. Mrs. Collins wrapped her arm around his shoulders, holding him as he wept. "Let it out," she murmured, her own tears flowing freely. "Just let it all out, sweet boy. It's time. It's time to let him go." They cried together for a long time, the bereaved mother and the heartbroken friend, grieving for the boy they both loved and lost. The boy who'd tried, in his own way, to protect them from an awful truth, to shield them from the darkness he'd carried alone for too long. When their tears were spent, James straightened, wiping his eyes. He looked down at the letter in his hands, then up at Mrs. Collins. Understanding passed between them, an unspoken agreement born of shared sorrow and hard-won wisdom. James refolded the letter and tucked it carefully back inside the envelope along with the precious photograph. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed to his feet and held out his hand to Mrs. Collins. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go home." Hand in hand, they walked out of the cemetery, leaving the past and its buried secrets behind. The autumn wind whispered through the trees, scattering golden leaves in their wake. James breathed deeply of the crisp air, felt the warmth of the sun on his face. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day for adventures and laughter, for friendship and new beginnings. Geoffrey's letter crinkled in his pocket, a comforting weight, a reminder. Live, he'd said, live for both of us. James intended to do just that, to honor his friend's last wish and final gift. He would set them both free, but he would never, ever forget. As they reached the cemetery gates, James paused, turning to look back one last time. His eyes found Geoffrey's headstone, small and weathered in the distance. "Goodbye, brother," he whispered, "and thank you." Then he faced forward again and stepped out into the light, into a world made new by truth and memory and love, a world where he chose to smile,